Hi, everyone. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about knowledge and why knowledge is so important. One of the things that we hear far too often these days is that retrieval practice, in particular in testing, is just it's silly because it only encourages rote memorization of information, and we don't need rote memorization in a world where Google is at our fingertips. So there are a couple things wrong with that statement. The first is that testing can be used for higher order thinking, and there is lots of great material out there on that. We have a blog post specifically about that, so you can go check that out. But I want to talk about the latter part of that statement. Why Google is not sufficient. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but let's chat about it a bit. So in today's world, that is an argument that's made a lot, that we don't need to memorize facts anymore because we can look up anything that we need. And I'm going to argue today that actually we really do need facts for lots and lots of reasons. So prior knowledge on any given topic is extremely helpful for lots of reasons. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of these reasons with you today. So the first reason why prior knowledge is important, why it's important to actually have this information in our heads and not just in Google, is because it helps us to acquire more information. So one place where that's really important is in reading comprehension. So in order to be able to read something quickly and easily and understand it, we have to understand the words that are in front of us. That makes good sense, right? That the better we understand the content that we're reading, if you don't have to look up every other word, the quicker you'll be able to read and understand and digest that information. But it's not just for reading comprehension. This is also important when we're just talking about acquiring new knowledge. So in order to understand this, we have to understand a little bit about the way that knowledge exists in our brains. And it sort of exists like a spider web, if you will. And so we have all of these different nodes and connections between them. So the way that the concept of doctor is related to the concept of nurse. These things are related to each other. And then separately, those two things might be related to the concept of needle, and those two things are connected. And so these are all have their own connections to each other. And so when we think of one of these things, it spreads and activates this other knowledge so that then we're better able to predict what's going to happen in different situations because we have this web of knowledge. So when we are trying to acquire new information, what happens is that we are better able to understand, recall, and use new information if it can connect to any of those existing nodes. So if we have some new concept about doctors that we've just learned, or we've just heard that someone is a doctor, let's say. So now we have this new person, Dr. So-and-so. We know that that person is a doctor. So now we've predicted that that person has maybe knowledge of how to perform CPR. That person knows something about needles. That person, etc. Right? So we know all of this information about them simply by knowing that they're a doctor. We didn't have to look any of that up because we have knowledge of what doctors are. We know all this stuff about Dr. So-and-so right away. Okay, that helps us in problem solving. So if we're in a situation and we need a doctor, knowing that that person might be someone who can perform CPR, we would know who to call. That's a little outside of the scope. So it does give us some idea of problem solving, of transfer, how we can use information. But it also means that we're more likely to remember that later on. This is similar to when I was in my first year of graduate school, and I was in the Brain Behavior and Cognition program at Washington University in St. Louis. And I remember going to one of the very first brown bag talks that we had by a neuroscientist. And they're going through this talk, and I understood everything for the first 3 slides, maybe. But then they started using words I was not familiar with, methods that I was not familiar with, terminology that had no nodes to connect to. I couldn't figure out based on context clues what was going on because I had no context clues. There was just this isolated fact over here that they had just said, and the minute we went on to the next slide, I could not tell you anything about that fact, anything at all, because it didn't have any existing knowledge to stick onto. Okay. However, later in my graduate career, or midway through my graduate career, I would be able to, even if I didn't know about this particular topic that they were discussing, I could still sort of get an idea of what was going on because I had some of the terminology, the brain structures that they were discussing, the methodology that they were using. I had seen these things before. So now, even though I'm not entirely sure what it is that they're talking about, I do know some about it because I can stick that onto existing nodes, existing knowledge, prior knowledge that I have about that given topic. And so when we use things like retrieval practice, what we're doing is we're strengthening the connections between these nodes, and we're reorganizing what that web looks like so that when we are coming in with new knowledge, we can better understand it by placing it in that web in a way that makes sense, and then reorganizing that web in a way that makes sense. So prior knowledge is really important there. But prior knowledge doesn't just help us to understand things. It doesn't just help us to take in new information. It also helps us when we go to try to use that information. So in problem-solving situations, it helps us to think faster. And that's really important in today's world. That helps in pretty much any career that someone's in. You're going to be more successful if you can think quicker on the job. So this is really important for our students later in life. To have more knowledge allows them to use that knowledge later in a faster and more efficient way. And here's one of the ways in which that works. So there's a very famous study about chess, and again, we have a blog on that, so you can go check that out if you want, but I'll give you a brief summary here. So in this particular study, what they did was they looked at chess players who were experts and novices. So a novice chess player would be someone like me who has maybe played chess a couple of times, but can barely tell you what the different players are, or different figurines are called, and certainly cannot tell you how each of them can move, and I know no moves, right? I am definitely a chess novice. A chess expert here was, I think, Class A master, which makes no sense to me because I have no prior knowledge here, but they're someone who has expertise in the game of chess. Okay, so what they did in this was they had someone take a chessboard in the middle of a real game, and they gave the novices and the experts just a little bit of time to try to memorize what that board looked like. So just one board shown to each of them. Then it was taken away and they were asked to recreate it. And unsurprisingly, the novices did terrible at this task, and the experts did fantastic. So what they did next was they gave them a random board. This would be if somebody gave me all the chess pieces and a board and said, here, put the pieces out there, and I don't know where any of them go, so I'm just putting them at random. So they gave them to both of them, and now the novices performed just as well as the masters. Everybody performed terribly, basically. So what's happening here? If you go and you ask chess masters, and I actually did this in my class last semester, I had a chess master in my class. And so we discussed what is happening in someone's head when they're looking at that board. And what he said was when he looks at that board, he's not just seeing random pieces, obviously. What he's seeing is a play, and what the next play should be, and the 4 or 5 different moves he could make in this situation. And all of this is coming to him instantaneously. Within 5 seconds of looking at that board, he knows the move that he's planning to make next. That's pretty impressive, first of all. But it's also a completely different way of thinking about what's in front of him than what the novice is doing, which is just literally trying to memorize individual pieces. What this means is that with prior knowledge, we can see a certain situation much more holistically than if we are seeing sort of these component parts. If you have tried to solve the same type of situation 40 times before, and you come to a very similar situation again, you're going to approach it differently. You're going to think about how that problem has been solved previously. You're going to think about how these things are related to each other because you have those existing knowledge structures. Then if you're coming to it for the first time and you don't see how these things are related to each other because you've never been taught that before. So prior knowledge helps us not only to understand material, to acquire new material, but it also helps us to think about what we know in a faster, more efficient way that helps us problem solve better. Okay? So I would argue that yes, one of the goals of education is indeed to put facts in heads. Okay, to give knowledge to students. And no, we don't want isolated facts. We want students to understand the rich interconnections between material, not simple isolated facts, of course. But we do want to encourage knowledge. That is very important in today's fast-paced world. And so I would argue that, yeah, Google can't do everything for us. You have to know what to Google. And you can't Google everything in a given situation quick enough in order to solve a problem. So I hope I've convinced you that these 6 strategies for effective learning, and especially retrieval practice, while yes, can be used for knowledge acquisition can be a pretty good thing. Thanks. Have a good day.